In the spring of 1962, a seed company representative named Howard Mills drove his Chevrolet down a gravel road in Marshall County, Iowa, looking for the last holdout. Every other farmer in the county had switched to the new hybrid corn seeds. The hybrids were a miracle of modern science, bred in laboratories, tested in research plots, guaranteed to produce 20% more yield than any traditional variety. The future of American agriculture, the company called them, the end of the old ways. Every farmer had signed up, except one. Howard pulled into the driveway of a 320-acre farm owned by a 71-year-old man named Elmer Dawson. He found Elmer in the barn, filling cloth seed bags from a collection of mason jars, each jar carefully labeled with a year and a strange German word, Urgroßvater. "Mr. Dawson?" "Howard Mills, from Pioneer Seed Company. Mind if I have a word?" Elmer looked up. His hands were stained with the dust of seeds that looked different from the uniform kernels Howard sold. Irregular shapes, varied colors, old. "You're here to sell me those laboratory seeds. I'm here to offer you a better future, Mr. Dawson. Our hybrid corn yields 20% more than my grandfather's seeds. I know. You told me last year, and the year before that. Then why won't you switch?" Elmer held up a handful of his seeds, golden and red and brown kernels, no two exactly alike. "These seeds came from Germany in 1887. My grandfather carried them in his pocket when he walked off the boat in New York. He planted them in Nebraska, then brought them here when he bought this land in 3 generations of Dawsons have grown this corn." "That's a lovely story, Mr. Dawson. But these seeds survived the drought of They survived because they're not all the same. Some are early, some are late. Some like it wet, some like it dry. When one fails, another succeeds." Elmer poured the seeds back into their jar. "Your laboratory seeds are all identical, every kernel the same. And someday, Mr. Mills, that's going to be a problem. Mr. Dawson, with all due respect, your scientists never walked behind a plow. They never watched a crop die and wondered if their family would eat that winter. They breed seeds in a laboratory where everything is controlled. But farming isn't controlled, Mr. Mills. Farming is chaos. And these seeds," he held up the jar, "these seeds know how to survive chaos." Howard Mills drove away that day without a sale. He marked Elmer Dawson down in his ledger as resistant and moved on to easier targets. Elmer Dawson kept planting his grandfather's seeds. Let me tell you about those seeds, because they're the heart of this story. When Friedrich Dawson left Bavaria in 1887, he was 17 years old, penniless, and carrying everything he owned in a single canvas bag. But sewn into the lining of his coat were 2 pounds of corn seeds, seeds from his family's farm. Seeds that had been selected and saved and replanted for generations beyond counting. In the old country, farmers didn't buy seeds. They saved them. Every harvest, you kept the best ears from the best plants, dried them carefully, stored them through the winter, and planted them in the spring. Over time, the seeds became adapted to your specific land, your specific climate, your specific farming practices. They became, in a very real sense, part of your family. Friedrich planted those German seeds in American soil and watched them grow. Not all of them thrived. Some varieties couldn't handle the Nebraska winters, but enough survived to produce a crop, and from that crop Friedrich saved the best seeds, and from those seeds he planted again, and again, and again. By the time Friedrich's son Ernst took over the farm in 1912, the Dawson corn had become something unique, not quite German anymore, not quite American, but perfectly adapted to the specific conditions of that specific land. When Ernst moved to Iowa in 1920 and bought new land in Marshall County, he brought the seeds with him, and they adapted again. By 1962, when Elmer Dawson refused Howard Mills hybrids, the Dawson corn had been evolving for 75 years. It had survived droughts that killed other crops because some plants in every generation had deeper roots. It had survived floods because some plants could handle wet feet. It had survived blights and rusts and molds because the genetic diversity, All those different kernels, no two exactly alike, meant that something always survived. That diversity was exactly what the hybrid seed companies had bred out. Let me tell you about hybrid corn, because understanding it is essential to understanding what happened next. Hybrid corn was developed in the 1930s and 40s by crossing carefully selected parent lines to produce offspring with specific desirable traits. The hybrids grew taller, produced more ears, matured more uniformly, yielded more bushels per acre. They were, by almost every measure, superior to the open-pollinated varieties that farmers had grown for centuries. But hybrids had a weakness. Because they were produced by crossing specific parent lines, every kernel was genetically identical. Every plant in a hybrid field was, in effect, a clone of every other plant. If a disease could infect one plant, it could infect them all. If a pest could eat one plant, it could eat them all. If conditions weren't perfect for that specific hybrid's needs, the entire field suffered together. The old varieties were different. Because farmers had saved seeds from open-pollinated plants for generations, every kernel contained a slightly different genetic mix. Some plants were taller, some shorter, some matured early, some late. Some resisted certain diseases, others resisted different ones. In any given year, some plants would do poorly, but others would thrive. The field as a whole survived because it contained multitudes. The seed companies knew about this weakness. They'd seen the southern corn leaf blight of 1970, which had destroyed 15% of the American corn crop because almost all the commercial hybrids shared the same susceptibility to the fungus. They developed new hybrids with different genetics to prevent a repeat. But they hadn't solved the fundamental problem. They just changed which vulnerability the crops shared. Elmer Dawson didn't know the science. He just knew what he'd seen with his own eyes: uniform crops failing, diverse crops surviving. His grandfather's seeds had survived everything Iowa could throw at them for 75 years. The hybrids had been around for 2 decades. He'd rather trust 75 years than 20. Let me tell you about Elmer's death, because that's when the story nearly ended. Elmer Dawson died in the spring of 1975, at the age of 84. He'd farmed the same land for over 50 years, planted his grandfather's seeds every spring, saved the best years every fall. The mason jars in his barn held seeds from every harvest since 1925, 50 years of genetic selection, 50 years of adaptation. His son Carl inherited the farm. Carl was 44 years old, a practical man, a modern man. He'd gone to agricultural college. He understood the science of hybrid vigor. He knew his father's attachment to the old seeds was sentimental, not rational. But Carl also remembered something his father had said years ago during a late-night conversation about the future of the farm. The companies want you to depend on them. They want you to buy new seeds every year, because then they can charge you whatever they want. But if you save your own seeds, you're free. You don't need them. And freedom, son. Freedom is worth something. Carl looked at the mason jars in the barn. 50 years of seeds. His grandfather's seeds. His father's legacy. He couldn't throw them away. Instead, he made a compromise. He planted hybrids on most of his land. 280 acres, the modern way, the profitable way. But he kept 40 acres for his father's seeds. 40 acres of heritage corn, planted and harvested and saved the old way, just like the Dawsons had always done. His neighbors thought he was sentimental. The seed company representative, a young man named Douglas who'd replaced the long-retired Howard Mills, thought he was wasting good land. The John Deere dealer, a man named Bill Patterson, laughed openly at Carl's museum farming. 40 acres of antique corn, Bill said at the feed store one morning. What's next, Carl? Gonna plow with mules? Harvest with a sickle? Carl just shrugged. Insurance, he said. Insurance against what? Carl didn't have a good answer for that. He just knew that his father had kept those seeds for a reason, and his grandfather before that, and Friedrich Dawson before that. 100 years of Dawsons, all saving the same seeds. There had to be a reason. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever held on to something that everyone told you was worthless? An old tool, an old technique, an old way of doing things that the modern world had left behind? Most people give in eventually. The pressure to conform, to modernize, to join the mainstream. It wears you down. It's easier to be like everyone else. It's cheaper, often. It's less lonely. Carl Dawson held on for 18 years. 18 years of planting 40 acres of heritage corn while his neighbors planted hybrids. 18 years of lower yields on that 40 acres. 18 years of jokes about Carl's museum and Carl's antique corn. He held on because his father had asked him to. He held on because somewhere, deep down, he believed there was a reason. In 1993, he found out what the reason was. Let me tell you about the Blight, because it changed everything. The summer of 1993 was hot and wet, perfect conditions for corn, but also perfect conditions for something else. In late June, farmers in southern Iowa started noticing lesions on their corn leaves. Brown spots, spreading fast. Within days, entire fields were affected. The Agricultural Extension Service identified the culprit, a new strain of southern cornleaf blight, similar to the one that had devastated crops in 1970, but different enough that the modern hybrids had no resistance. The fungus spread through the air, carried on wind and rain, and every hybrid variety on the market was susceptible. By mid-July, the blight had reached Marshall County. Carl watched it come. He'd heard the news from the southern counties, seen the reports on the agricultural channels, talked to the extension agents who were scrambling to understand what was happening. There was no treatment. There was no cure. You just watched your corn die and hoped it stopped before it took everything. The first cases appeared on his neighbor's land, Tom Henderson, who farmed 800 acres of hybrid corn to the east. Tom had been one of the loudest voices mocking Carl's heritage seeds. Living in the past, Tom had said, afraid of the future. Now Tom's future was turning brown. Carl walked his own fields every day, checking for signs of infection. The hybrids on his 280 acres were showing symptoms by the third week of July. The same lesions, the same spreading death. But the 40 acres of heritage corn, his father's corn, his grandfather's corn, looked different. Some plants were sick. Here and there, Carl could see the telltale brown spots on leaves, the spreading infection. But other plants, many plants, looked healthy. Green leaves, strong stalks, no sign of disease. The heritage corn wasn't immune. But it wasn't uniform either. Some plants had resistance that others lacked, and the resistant plants were thriving, even as their susceptible neighbors died. Let me tell you about the day the seed company came, because that's when Carl understood what his father had given him. It was August 15th. The county agricultural agent had written a report about the blight, documenting which farms had been affected, and how badly. The report noted that one farm, Carl Dawson's, had experienced significantly lower losses than average, and that a 40-acre plot on that farm had experienced almost no losses at all. The report made its way up the chain, from the county to the state to the regional seed company offices. And 3 days later, a black SUV pulled into Carl Dawson's driveway, carrying 2 men in suits and a woman with a clipboard. Carl was in his barn, preparing for what harvest he could salvage, when they found him. "Mr. Dawson, I'm Richard Coleman, Director of Genetic Research for Pioneer Seed Company. This is Dr. Sarah Chen, our Chief Plant Pathologist, and Thomas Bradley, our Acquisition Specialist." Carl looked at the suits, the shiny shoes, the clipboard. "You're here about the corn." "We're here about your corn, Mr. Dawson. Your heritage variety, the one that survived the blight." Carl led them to the 40-acre field. Even from the edge, the contrast was visible. To the east, Tom Henderson's land was a wasteland. Brown stalks, dead leaves, a total loss. To the west, Carl's heritage corn stood green and tall, ears forming, tassels golden in the summer sun. Dr. Chen walked into the field and started examining plants, taking leaf samples, making notes. Richard Coleman stood at the edge, looking at the green corn with an expression Carl had never seen on a seed company man's face before. Fear. "Mr. Dawson," Coleman said, "where did you get these seeds?" "My grandfather brought them from Germany in And you've been planting them continuously since then? Saving seeds each year?" "My family has, yes." "Have you ever crossed them with commercial varieties? Hybridized them in any way?" "No. My father was very clear about that. These seeds stay pure." Coleman nodded slowly. "Mr. Dawson, I'm going to be direct with you. This blight has destroyed approximately 40% of Iowa's corn crop. The losses nationwide will be in the billions of dollars. Every commercial hybrid we sell is susceptible. We have nothing that can resist this pathogen." He gestured at the green field. "Except this. This field shouldn't be possible. By every model we have, every projection, these plants should be dead. But they're not. They're thriving. And we need to understand why." Thomas Bradley, the acquisitions specialist, stepped forward with a briefcase. "Mr. Dawson, Pioneer Seed Company would like to make you an offer. We want exclusive rights to your heritage seed genetics. We'll use them to develop new resistant hybrids, license the genetics to other companies, potentially save the American corn industry from a catastrophe that could take years to recover from." He opened the briefcase. Carl caught a glimpse of papers, contracts, numbers with a lot of zeros. $1 million, Mr. Dawson, for exclusive rights to your grandfather's seeds." The barn was silent. Carl looked at the briefcase, then at the green field, then at the mason jars lining the shelves behind him. 50 years of seeds. His father's legacy. His grandfather's gift. "No," he said. Bradley's face went pale. "Mr. Dawson, perhaps you didn't understand. 1 million, I understood fine. The answer is no. Now let me tell you about the negotiation, because it went on for 3 days. The seed company people didn't leave. They booked rooms at the motel in Marshalltown and came back the next morning with a revised offer. $2 million, then 2.5, then 3. Carl refused each time. Dr. Chen, who'd spent 2 days studying his corn, tried a different approach. She sat with Carl on his porch one evening, without the suits, without the briefcase, just scientist to farmer. "I have to understand," she said. "Why won't you sell? $3 million is more than this farm is worth, more than 10 farms. You could retire, travel, do anything you want." Carl was quiet for a long moment. "Do you know what my father told me the night before he died?"
"What?"
He said, "The seeds don't belong to us. We belong to them. I didn't understand it then. I'm starting to understand it now." "What do you mean?" Carl looked out at his field, the green field, the living field, the field that had survived when everything around it died. "My great-grandfather brought these seeds from Germany because they were his connection to home, his identity, his family's history, going back generations. When he planted them in America, he wasn't just growing corn. He was planting his family in new soil." He pointed at the mason jars visible through the barn door. "Those jars contain 100 years of my family's work, 100 years of choosing the best seeds, adapting to this land, surviving everything nature threw at them. If I sell that to your company, what happens? You take the genetics, you breed new hybrids, you patent them, you sell them back to farmers for profit. The seeds become yours, not ours. The 100 years become your property. But the genetics would survive. The resistance would spread. Millions of acres of corn could be saved. Could be. Or your company could bury it if the patents aren't profitable. Or breed it into varieties that have other weaknesses. Or sell it to the highest bidder while farmers go bankrupt." Carl shook his head. "My father didn't trust corporations, Dr. Chen. He saw what happened when farmers stopped saving seeds. They became dependent on companies that cared about profit, not farming. He kept these seeds free. He asked me to keep them free, and that's what I'm going to do. Free meaning I'll share them with any farmer who wants them for nothing. Let me tell you about the seed sharing, because that's how Carl Dawson changed Iowa farming. The word spread fast. Within a week of the seed company's visit, farmers from 3 counties were showing up at Carl's door, asking about his heritage corn. The blight had devastated their crops. They'd lost everything, and they'd heard that Carl Dawson had seeds that survived. Carl gave them seeds, for free. He opened his father's mason jars, the ones from the best years, the jars labeled Urgroßvater, in his father's careful handwriting, and he divided them into smaller portions, enough for each farmer to plant a test plot the following spring. These aren't hybrids, he told them. They won't yield as much, at least not at first. But you can save seeds from them. You can select the best plants, keep the best ears, build your own adapted varieties. In 5 years, 10 years, you'll have corn that's perfectly suited to your land, and you'll never have to buy seeds again. Some farmers were skeptical. They'd spent 20 years buying hybrids, trusting the companies, believing that science had superseded tradition. It was hard to accept that an old man's mason jars might be worth more than a laboratory. But desperation changes minds, and the blight had made everyone desperate. By the spring of 1994, over 200 farmers in Iowa were planting Carl Dawson's heritage seeds. By 1995, the number had doubled. By 2000, there were heritage seed networks across the Midwest, farmers sharing genetics, comparing notes, rebuilding the diversity that a generation of hybrid monoculture had destroyed. The seed companies didn't disappear. They adapted, eventually, developing new resistant varieties by, ironically, incorporating genetics from heritage lines, like Carl's. They learned the lesson the hard way. Uniformity is efficient, but diversity survives. Let me tell you about the last visit from Pioneer Seed Company, because it happened in 2003. Carl Dawson was 82 years old by then. He'd handed off most of the farming to his daughter Ellen, who'd come back to the land after 20 years in Chicago. Ellen planted heritage corn on the whole 320 acres now. No more hybrids, no more dependence on companies. The yields were slightly lower than the neighbors, but the seeds were free, the soil was healthier, and the Dawsons answered to no one. Richard Coleman, the director of genetic research, drove out to the farm one more time. He was older too, gray-haired, close to retirement. He found Carl on the porch, watching Ellen work the fields. "Mr. Dawson, Mr. Coleman, it's been a while. 10 years. Coleman sat down in the empty chair without being invited. "I've thought about you a lot over those 10 years. Thought about my seeds, you mean. Thought about what you did. What you chose." Coleman looked out at the green fields, the healthy corn, the farm that had survived everything. "Do you know what happened after the blight? We spent $50 million developing resistant hybrids. We licensed genetics from heritage varieties all over the world. We patented everything we could, sued the farmers who saved seeds, tried to maintain our control of the market." "I know. I read the papers. And do you know what we learned? In all our research, all our laboratories, all our patents and lawsuits and corporate strategies?" "What?" Coleman smiled, a tired smile that acknowledged something lost. "We learned that your father was right. We learned that diversity survives and uniformity dies. We learned that 100 years of farmer selection is worth more than 50 years of corporate breeding. We learned that the old ways weren't obsolete. They were just waiting for us to remember why they mattered. My father could have told you that He did tell us. We weren't listening." Coleman stood up, brushed off his suit. "I'm retiring next year, and I've been thinking about what to do with my time."
I was wondering if you might teach me.
"Teach you what?" "How to save seeds. The old way. The way your grandfather did." Carl looked at the seed company man, the man who'd offered him $1 million, then $2 million, then $3 million, trying to buy what couldn't be bought. The man who represented everything Carl's father had warned him about. "Come back in the spring," Carl said. "I'll show you how it's done." Let me tell you about Carl's legacy, because it outlived him. Carl Dawson died in 2008, at the age of 87. He'd farmed until the last year of his life, saved seeds until his hands were too weak to open the mason jars. His daughter Ellen took over, and after her, Her son Michael, the sixth generation of Dawsons to plant Friedrich seeds in American soil. The seeds themselves had spread far beyond the family farm. By 2008, there were heritage seed networks in every farming state, thousands of farmers saving and sharing genetics that corporate breeding programs had abandoned or ignored. The worthless seeds that Elmer Dawson had refused to give up in 1962 had become the foundation of a movement, a return to diversity, to resilience, to the old ways that had sustained farming for 10,000 years before the corporations arrived. At Carl's funeral, Richard Coleman spoke. He'd become a friend over the last 5 years, visiting the farm each spring to help with planting, learning the rhythms of selection, and saving that his company had tried to replace. Carl Dawson taught me something that 40 years in the seed industry never did, Coleman said. He taught me that some things are more valuable than money, that survival is more important than profit, that the wisdom of generations passed down through mason jars and careful hands is worth more than all the laboratories in the world. He held up a small cloth bag, seeds from the last harvest, saved according to the Dawson method. These seeds aren't just corn. They're 120 years of adaptation. They're 5 generations of care. They're a promise from grandfather to grandson, from farmer to farmer, from past to future, that the old ways will survive, no matter what the new ways try to replace them with. He placed the bag on Carl's casket. Carl kept his father's promise. His daughter will keep his. And somewhere, 100 years from now, a farmer we'll never meet will plant these seeds and tell the story of the stubborn old man who refused to sell, refused to give up, refused to let a corporation own what belonged to the land. Let me tell you one final thing, because it's the thing that matters most. The Dawson seeds are still being planted today. Not just in Iowa, in 15 states, in 3 countries, in community seed banks and university archives and family farms that have joined the heritage seed movement. The genetics that Friedrich Dawson carried in his coat pocket in 1887 have become one of the most studied, most shared, most valuable corn lineages in North America. The seed companies never got their exclusive rights. They never patented the Dawson genetics. They learned eventually to work with heritage breeders instead of against them, to see diversity as an asset, not an obstacle. The old ways survived, not because they were better in every measure, but because they were resilient in ways that mattered when everything else failed. On the Dawson farm, there's a small building behind the main barn. Inside, on wooden shelves, are mason jars filled with seeds. Some are labeled in Carl's handwriting, some in Elmer's, some in Ernst's, faded almost beyond reading. And one jar, carefully preserved, bears a label in Old German script, Urgroßvater, 8 great-grandfather's seeds. The beginning of everything. Michael Dawson opens that jar once a year, takes out a handful of seeds, and mixes them with the current crop. Not for any scientific reason. The genetics have long since dispersed through the entire lineage, but as a ritual, a connection. A reminder that these seeds carry more than DNA. They carry a story, a family, a choice made by a young man walking off a boat in New York Harbor, carrying everything he owned in a canvas bag and 2 pounds of seeds sewn into his coat. They carry the truth that Elmer Dawson knew in 1962, that Carl knew in 1993, that every Dawson has known since Friedrich first put seeds in American soil. Some things are worth more than money. Some things are worth more than efficiency. Some things are worth keeping, even when the whole world tells you to let them go. The Dawson seeds survived because one family refused to give up on them, because one farmer said no when everyone said yes, because holding on to the past sometimes turns out to be the only way to survive the future. That's not stubbornness, that's wisdom. And wisdom, like seeds, is meant to be shared. Opus 4.5,